Hello, this is Pocho Salcedo, and I'm glad to have you with us in Latin America and across the continental United States and Hawaii. Today, we're taking you from New York on a journey that explores what lies behind the headlines. Welcome to the DNA of the news. Think of an industry that makes more than $24 billion a year from exports, more than the US sold soybeans to the world in 2021, or the total crude oil exports of Mexico in the same period. This is the blood plasma extraction industry that gets the raw material from about 20 million people here in the United States. To reveal the secrets of this industry, we're joined by a journalist who recently wrote the book Blood Money. It is a fascinating story. Kathleen McLaughlin, welcome to the DNA of the news.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Kathleen McLaughlin is an award-winning journalist who reports and writes about the consequences of economic inequality around the world. A frequent contributor to The Washington Post and The Guardian. McLaughlin's reporting has also appeared in The New York Times, BuzzFeed, The Atlantic, The Economist, NPR, and more. She is a former Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT and has won multiple awards for her reporting on labor issues around the globe. Blood Money is her first book. McLaughlin spent 15 years as a correspondent in China, where she won multiple Cebu Awards from the Association for Business Journalists for her reporting on labor and human rights abuses in the massive factories that supply the world's tech products and cheap clothing. She now lives in Montana, where she was born and raised, and continues to write about social justice and ongoing threats to democracy for The Guardian, The Nation and other national outlets.
The accounts narrated in Blood Money are educational and commanding because you did not approach the story as a distant or neutral clinical observer. You tell it in first person and connect yourself to the story. Well, the book starts with your experience of arriving at the Pudong airport in Shanghai and smuggling blood into China. Tell us why.
Well, so I had moved to China in the early 2000s to work as a journalist. And this was shortly after I had been diagnosed with a rare nerve disease. The treatment for my disease is periodic infusions of a drug that's made from human blood plasma. And at that time, China was just on the tail end of a massive AIDS and HIV outbreak that had actually been caused by things that had gone wrong in their plasma industry. So they banned the importation of foreign blood products, saying it was a protective measure against AIDS and HIV coming into the country. But AIDS and HIV were already rampaging through the country. In any case, you couldn't bring foreign blood, in literal blood, into China. So every time I went back to China for my work, I had to go through customs and check a little box that said I wasn't carrying blood when in fact I was. So it sounds kind of dangerous and crazy to say that I was smuggling blood, but I was. And in those days, it was pretty easy to go in and out of China without having your bag searched. So I never did get searched and I never did get caught. But that's basically how I kept living a normal life in China. The reason I didn't want to use domestic products on the Chinese market was that there were well-known instances of contamination. There were hepatitis outbreaks, HIV outbreaks, so their domestic blood supply simply wasn't safe. And all of this is kind of what led me to investigating what had happened in China, which then led me to investigating what was going on in the United States, with this bizarre and massive industry.
Kathleen, we will take a short detour here. You moved to work as a journalist in China in the early 2000s. You live and work there for 10 years or more before returning to the US again. And after becoming a true Chongguatong expert on China, what do you wish you had known at the start of your stay in China that you know now that would have made your understanding of that country easier?
Wow, that's such an interesting question. because for me, I felt like I actually needed to live there to understand it. It's such a complicated place. And the political system is so complicated and I think so misunderstood, that for me, the best way to learn the country and to learn about the political system and how it affected people's lives was to be there and talk to people in person. Before I went, I read every book I could get my hands on about China. I read everything I possibly could. I studied Chinese. I did all of that, but I really feel like I didn't have a handle on the place until I actually got there. I do think that it is misrepresented quite often, in popular media. Not there are a lot of good journalists who cover China, so not by journalism necessarily, but I think there are ideas about China that it's either similar to the old Soviet Union or similar to Japan. And it's a completely unique country, with completely unique economic and political systems. So honestly, for me, being there really was the thing that helped me to understand it. And I have to say that I don't feel like I had a good grasp on the place until I was there for about a year. And then I felt like, oh, okay, now I start to see how things really work. But I will say too, I think I made the classic American mistake, which is thinking that this place is so completely different from where I come from. And then by the time that I left, sort of discovering that actually capitalism, which had taken over China, was exactly the same everywhere and has the same pitfalls and potential rewards for some people. But it was interesting by the time I left, where I really had this idea that, oh, actually, there are a lot of similarities between our system and the Chinese system. So it was quite a journey to understanding for me. And I don't think I would have understood it had I not lived there.
Thank you very much. That is a unique perspective from within China. And I would like to connect that with a Chinese scientist you met, Dr. Wang Xuping. You met her in the United States, and she was a whistleblower during that epidemic and that crisis you were talking about, and had some thoughts about the plasma industry. And she inspired you as you were going about researching your book.
Yeah. So Wang Xuping is the doctor who blew the whistle on the AIDS crisis in China. She was working in what they called the plasma economy, which was a scheme China had set up to extract the plasma of poor people and sell it for profit. And she was someone in charge of monitoring the health of donors. She discovered the AIDS epidemic within the plasma system, and she blew the whistle and let authorities know that they had a problem and the system was spreading this epidemic. And she was essentially harassed out of a job. Her family was harassed. She was beaten up at one point. So she fled to the US, where she lived in Salt Lake City and worked as a cancer researcher. And I wanted to interview her because I was trying to understand the plasma economy and how that all fell apart and how she blew the whistle. So I went to Salt Lake City to meet her, spent several days with her. And at the end of the trip, she said to me, I need to show you something. And so she took me to a plasma center in downtown Salt Lake City. And she said, you need to figure out what's going on in this place, because it's not exactly what we were doing in China, but it feels the same. And I'm worried that there's going to be problems here as well. So I had been in China, again, as I had that kind of naive American attitude, I think at some points where I thought, oh, only China would come up with this idea to extract the blood of poor people and sell it for profit. And Wang Xuping really clarified for me that no, actually, America is the one that's doing this, and it's successful and it's happening and it doesn't get enough attention. So she's really the one who noticed what was going on in the US because of her experience in China and then led me to it. Unfortunately, she died quite young. I believe she was only 56. She had a heart attack a couple of years ago and died in Salt Lake. So she never got to read the book, but it was really written for her and inspired by her.
Thank you very much. That is an extraordinary story. Talking about plasma, there are only 5 countries that have public and private collection centers of blood plasma in exchange for monetary compensation: the US, Germany, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Austria. However, legislators from the European Union are presently in discussions confronting a long-standing taboo over giving plasma, chiefly on the account that there are not enough donors and they heavily depend on the importation of plasma, mainly from the United States. Your thoughts, please.
I don't know. It's very interesting to me because I have spent some time in Europe talking to people about this industry. And I should say, one of the major corporations that it kind of controls this industry is based in Spain. So there is a heavy European component to the industry itself. It's really a global endeavor. But just in talking to normal people and other journalists, I would say that ordinary people are kind of shocked by the idea of selling your blood plasma for money and that you're in an economic situation where people would need to do that. Now, when I point out to them that they don't have to do this because Americans and Mexican citizens in the US are doing this already so that they don't need to, it changes the conversation a bit. I guess after spending so much time on this book, my takeaway right now is that maybe we need to pay people for plasma. Maybe that's not the real taboo, but I think we need to pay people more. And I think that the way the industry is set up right now, it is really predatory toward poor people and people who are lower on the economic rung of society. It really targets them. And I think the industry could be better if it changed away from this kind of predatory nature. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens in Europe because I know there's a lot of resistance to the idea. And right now, it's not 100% necessary because we have so many Americans who are struggling financially right now that we really do feed the world's demand for blood products. It's kind of funny. I was talking to someone a few months ago about this whole industry and trying to explain it. And they said to me, is there like a developing country somewhere in the world that, supplies most of the world's plasma? And I said, yeah, it's the United States. It's us. We are the developing country in this framing. So it would be, I'll be very curious to see what happens in Europe. And I don't know. I think there is so much social stigma against it there. It is really a step to go from not having paid plasma to having a paid plasma system that preys upon poor people. So I'll be curious to follow that debate and see what they come up with because they have for decades recommended against doing it.
Well, reading and hearing your interviews, I learned that the US provides up to 70% of the world's plasma. The export revenue of this industry is staggering 24 billion for 2021, surpassing its export value of soybeans, or the total sales equivalent to the coffee exports of the 10 leading nations in the world. I also discovered that this export is superior to the crude oil coming out of Mexico.
Wow.
And when we come back, you're going to tell us why this industry is under the radar and why we don't know much about it. We'll be
Great.
right back.
Happy to.
And we are back with Kathleen McLaughlin. She is joining us from Montana here in the United States. Kathleen, most sailors come from the middle class here in the United States. They often have jobs, but struggle to make ends meet. The use of the money from selling plasma helps them to buy groceries, cover bills, etc. You visit several places in the United States, chiefly in the southern border, and you even went to Flint, Michigan, if I'm correct, and someplace north. Tell us what you found.
In Idaho, yeah. Well, so I wanted to pick 3 places that were very different demographically. I wanted to really show that this is something that affects people of all races and cultural backgrounds, But the chief characteristic that they share is economic hardship. And so I chose Rexburg, Idaho, which is, I believe, 95% white and 95% Mormon. And then I chose Flint, which is majority Black. And then I went to El Paso, Texas, and interviewed Mexican citizens who crossed the border on day passes to sell plasma, because I wanted to get that demographic as well. I thought it was really important to show how this affects different diverse groups, but in the same way. So for me, I honestly think that, I mean, each of these places was startling in their own way. So the reason there are a ton of people who sell plasma in Rexburg is because they have a huge college there. And these are a lot of college students who come from families that are not wealthy. So this has become a thing that college students do in a lot of places to replace income that they simply don't have. In Flint, we all know the story of Flint, how it was abandoned by the auto companies, and it's been on economic hard times ever since. So Flint has a huge number of plasma centers for a pretty small population, and people do it all the time. El Paso, to me, may have been the most startling. So in court documents, there was a lawsuit over the border being closed during the pandemic, and plasma sellers were not allowed to come into the US. So first of all, I should tell you that selling plasma is banned in Mexico like the rest of the world. So there are Mexican citizens who live along the border with the United States who come into the US to do it as an income. And the money for them, I think, is much more powerful in a lot of ways than it is for middle-class Americans, because it can replace an entire income. The plasma industry has referred to its collection of plasma centers along the US-Mexico border as the most productive in the world. So at one point before the pandemic, there were 10,000 people every week crossing into the US from Mexico to sell plasma. So you can really see the disparity between a rich country on one side and money going back into a much poorer country on the other side of the border. And people I interviewed from Mexico, I would say, for the most part, were conflicted about this, like everyone else I interviewed, in that they didn't so much mind doing it. It did make some of them sick, but they felt like in the end it was worth it because the income was good and it was something that they couldn't have earned back home. So when I talk about the global nature of the plasma industry, Mexico is a huge part of that, because this isn't just American citizens selling their blood plasma. It is a huge number of Mexican citizens. Now, the border was closed during the pandemic, and during that period, the US government tried to ban Mexican citizens from selling plasma in the US, saying that it was labor. That lawsuit is still kind of in limbo, but I have spoken with some of the people that I interviewed who live in Juarez, Mexico, and they have returned. And they have been told that it's legal and safe for them to return. There was a lot of anxiety about coming back after they closed the border, but people have started coming back. And so, I mean, that was very revealing to me that this industry is so big and there are so many people who are in desperate need of extra income that you have an entire stream of citizens coming in from another country to sell plasma in the US.
The Red Cross, which does not pay, limits you to donating 13 times yearly. But
that's right. Yeah, if you donate plasma at the Red Cross, yeah.
For-profit centers, you can go as many as 104. So, what are the immediate short and long-term effects of donating blood plasma?
So this was quite interesting to me. In the course of reporting the book, I interviewed more than 100 plasma donors, and there are, and this is all anecdotal, I don't have a scientific study, but I would say half of the people I interviewed had immediate side effects, and that includes nausea, chills, headaches. Some people had to go home and sleep for the rest of the day because they found the process so exhausting. In the long term, there have been some studies that show people's protein levels are sort of permanently altered if they do this on a long-term basis. I don't believe there's been enough long-term study. And I think the reason, so you mentioned the Red Cross, limits plasma donation to 13 times a year as opposed to 104 from the for-profit centers. I think the reason for that is the Red Cross is very protective of its donors' health. And it makes me question, what do they know about this process that for-profit companies might not be telling us? What have they seen? I mean, I think about a woman I met who literally would donate plasma, walk outside to the parking lot, and then pass out in her car before she could drive home. So it is draining something essential from your body. There hasn't been any evidence that this is horrible for your health long term, but I will say I think it definitely deserves more scrutiny and more study. There's not enough long-term scientific study to show what this does to people.
One of the things that stuck with me is when you share the cost of the infusions that you receive in the, I think about $13,000 now, and every year it goes up.
It's gone up now. So the book just came out in February. I finished the book last year. It came out in February, and at that time my infusions were 13,000. Right now they're up to 15,000. So it's gone up. And luckily I have insurance that covers them, but it has gone up exponentially every year. And to me, there's such a gap in the middle. So if you sell plasma, you might make $25, $40 per time. I'm not getting a direct infusion of plasma. This is made into medication that contains a lot of different things. But there is such a gap in the middle of all of this. The profit, it's a multi-billion-dollar profit-making industry. And so there are companies and people who are getting rich on the blood of American and Mexican citizens who are economically disadvantaged. I mean, my medication just gets more and more and more expensive every year.
Why is it then that this industry is almost stealth? It's $24 billion. It is under the radar. Why do you think is that?
I think it's a couple of, I've thought about this a lot. I think it's a couple of parts. I think, first of all, people who sell plasma and depend on this industry for an income don't want it to go away because it's an essential income source for a lot of people. Most people don't pay taxes on the payment they get. They don't have to. It's not declared as income. The industry certainly doesn't want more scrutiny. So you have people on one side who are earning an income in a gray market economy. And then you have companies who are amassing huge profits off of that economy at the same time. And I think for both sides of the equation, there are massive risks to talking about it more openly. When the book was first published, I was very surprised because I got a little backlash on social media from people who sell plasma. And I thought, obviously they hadn't read the book, because in the book, I call for them to get paid more. That's my entire argument, is that people should earn more money for doing this. But I think that because it is something that Americans have become so dependent on for income, that they don't want to lose it, even though it's an unpleasant endeavor, even though it's predatory, even though it's exploitive by its very nature. I think that people are afraid of losing the income from it. So they're not calling for changes to the industry. And obviously, you have a $24 billion industry making huge profits. The industry itself is not going to call for changes either. And I think that's what keeps it underground. At the same time, we know about the United States that our elected officials are not poor. Our elected officials are not people who have had to sell plasma in the past. And so I don't think it's on their radar at all either. So it's this kind of conflux of factors. It's not noticed because no one involved in it really wants it to be noticed.
Thank you. You have great stories in your book. You interview many people from all walks of life. In these last few minutes that we have left, can you share some of those stories that still stay with you after all this time?
Yeah, the one that really stuck with me, I met a woman who lives in Texas who got in trouble for traffic tickets and speeding fines, and she kind of ignored them. She was young and in her 20s and being a little bit careless, like a lot of us are in our 20s. And she built up this huge amount of court fees and fines. And eventually she faced a more serious charge and was looking at going to prison. And so she had to sell plasma to pay off her court fees and fines. And she's very open about this. She's really outspoken. She's someone who was quite an activist in this. And she told me, we were talking about the idea of selling a piece of yourself to pay bills and to pay for things like this. And she said to me, I would sell a kidney if I could. And I thought, now we're really at that point. So in the United States, you can only legally sell 3 body parts, and that's sperm, eggs, and blood plasma. But where are we on this trajectory that maybe, are we going to eventually allow people to sell organs like kidneys? So that really made me think. I'd also say some of the college students in Idaho were very interesting as well. That will stay with me because they were so young. You're talking to 19-year-olds who have been told this is completely safe to do and it's not going to cause any health problems. But I would say we don't really know that. And one young woman I spoke to outside of a plasma center there had the chills so bad that her teeth were chattering while we were talking. And she told me that just happens to her when she donates plasma. So we're kind of requiring 19-year-olds to do this thing that makes them physically ill in order to get by in life and get through college. And I think that'll stick with me as well. I mean, honestly, everyone I met will kind of stick with me. It's been really funny since the book has been published. I have people come up and show me their plasma scars now on their arms. So I think that even though people I think want to keep it sort of a secret industry, when I meet people now and talk with them about it, they're very open because I think it's so stigmatized that a lot of people haven't felt comfortable talking about it before. So I do get a lot of people come up and show me their scars now, which is really funny.
Kathleen, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for what you have written. Thank you for the work you do, and I really hope to have you back in the show sometime in the near future.
I would love that. Thank you so much. This was such a great conversation, and thank you for reading the book.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in and spending this time with us. Until the next time, this is the DNA of the news.